I will never forget the moment when my husband, Mark, grabbed the birth certificate from the nurse's hand after I had been in labor for 20 long, agonizing hours. My body was wrecked, my emotions in a complete whirlpool, and there, in that moment of vulnerability, he said those words that shattered everything. Our baby will have my mother's name, not yours. I remember looking at him, completely stunned, trying to process what he had just said. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. Maybe I had heard him wrong. But when I looked into his eyes, I knew he meant it. He wasn't joking. And that's when the weight of everything came crashing down on me. I had just given birth to our daughter, a child I had carried for months, through so many ups and downs, through countless worries and joys. And here he was, in front of me, making a decision about our child's identity without even consulting me. As the nurse quietly glanced between us, her gaze softening with pity, she leaned in and whispered, "Want me to tell him the truth?" I had no idea what she meant, but in that moment, it felt like the entire room froze. This was supposed to be a joyous moment, a moment I had been waiting for my entire pregnancy. But now, in the blink of an eye, everything felt twisted, like I was in a nightmare. Mark, not the man I had known and married, was suddenly someone unrecognizable. I felt so small in that moment, so helpless. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to steady myself. And that's when I made a choice. Looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. But hindsight is always 20/20ths, isn't it? From the very beginning, I had my doubts about Mark's relationship with his mother, Susan. She was a woman who seemed to make everything about herself. Her presence filled up every room, and it wasn't just because she was outspoken. It was the way she treated Mark. She didn't just love him, she worshipped him, as though he was the center of her world. At first, it was small things. Little digs about my appearance. Her comments about my career, about my background, nothing overt, just enough to make me feel like I didn't quite measure up to her standard. It was subtle, but it hurt. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just protective of her son. Maybe she was just trying to be helpful. But deep down, I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells around her. It wasn't until after we got engaged that I realized how deep her control ran. She had a say in everything. When Mark proposed, she wasn't happy with the ring he picked out, complaining that it wasn't fancy enough for her son. She didn't like the neighborhood we bought our first house in. She didn't like the layout. She didn't like the paint color. It felt like no matter what Mark and I did, it wasn't good enough for her. But I told myself that's just how she is. I made excuses for her behavior because, well, I loved Mark and he loved her. I thought I could handle it. I thought things would get better. How naive I was. Then we found out I was pregnant. I thought, this is it. This is going to change everything. I thought that maybe Susan would ease up once we were expecting, that this would finally make her back off and let me and Mark have our space. But it only got worse. From the moment Susan found out we were expecting, it was like a switch flipped. Suddenly, she had an opinion about everything. The baby names I liked? She hated them. She told me they weren't good enough. She tried to push me into following her so-called pregnancy diet, which was not only unrealistic, but borderline dangerous. Every appointment I went to, Susan would show up, acting like she was the one carrying the baby. She even tried to choose my doctor, suggesting that my OBGYN wasn't good enough. And Mark? He didn't back me up. He just let her do whatever she wanted. He didn't see the problem. Every time I tried to set a boundary, he brushed it off, saying, "You know how she is. She means well." But I had had enough. At 6 months pregnant, Susan made a comment that still sends a shiver down my spine. We were at dinner when she looked at me, dead in the eye, and said, "I hope the baby looks like Mark's side of the family. Your features wouldn't suit a girl." And do you know what Mark did? He sat there and said nothing. Not a word of defense. Not even a look of concern. That was when I started feeling the first cracks in my marriage. Up until that point, I had been calm, rational, letting things slide, but I knew something was wrong. My relationship with Mark was shifting, and I was starting to realize just how deep Susan's influence over him went. I thought I could handle it for the sake of the family, but every day, it was like the walls were closing in. When it was finally time for the baby to arrive, the stress had reached a boiling point. Labor was a brutal 20-hour experience. My body was in pain, my strength drained, and Mark was barely there. I don't mean physically he was there in the room, but emotionally, mentally, he was checked out. He was on his phone, taking calls from his mom, laughing with her as I screamed in pain. He left the room twice to grab coffee while I was in the middle of labor. I had never felt more alone in my life. This man, the one who was supposed to be my partner, the one who was supposed to be by my side through this, was nowhere to be found. It was as if I was going through this alone, while he continued to prioritize his mother over me and our baby. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, our daughter was born. But before I even had a chance to hold her, to feel the rush of love and relief, Mark grabbed the birth certificate. He didn't ask me. He didn't look at me. He didn't consult me about the name. He simply said, "Our baby will have my mother's name." And I knew, right in that moment, that I had been living in a lie. This wasn't the man I thought I married. This wasn't the father I had imagined for my child. The years of emotional manipulation, the years of being ignored and disregarded, they had led me to this point. I barely had the strength to speak, but I managed to whisper, "No, we had already agreed on a name together." And Mark's response? A smirk. A smirk that made me feel small, worthless. "You don't get a say," he said, almost smugly. I felt the weight of those words. He didn't just take control of our daughter's name. He was trying to take control of me, of everything. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. After that day in the hospital, when Mark made that decision about our daughter's name without even consulting me, I felt something in my chest shift. What had started as a small crack in our relationship was now a full-on fault line. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my mind. I had just endured a grueling 20-hour labor, the kind of physical and emotional toll that I wouldn't wish on anyone, and yet here I was, being told that my opinion didn't matter. The worst part? Mark didn't even seem to care. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to make it right. Instead, he just looked at me like I was being unreasonable. The weeks following our daughter's birth were a blur of exhaustion and frustration. I was healing physically, but emotionally, I was breaking. I knew deep down that I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Susan's influence over Mark had been growing for years, but now it felt like it was suffocating me. I wanted to be a mother, to experience this new chapter with the love and support of my husband, but instead, I felt like I was raising our child alone while Mark continued to prioritize his mother's opinion over mine. At home, things were no better. Every time I tried to have a conversation with Mark about the direction our relationship was heading, he would deflect, saying things like, "You're just tired from the baby," or "Let's talk about this later, okay?" But the later never came. It felt like my needs were constantly pushed aside, like I didn't matter. Susan would visit several times a week, and each time, she had something to say about how we were raising our daughter. She would pick apart my parenting choices, telling me I was doing everything wrong. At first, I tried to be patient. I tried to be respectful, but as the weeks wore on, the comments became unbearable. One day, I reached my breaking point. I was sitting in the living room, feeding our daughter when Susan came over. Without even greeting me, she walked straight up to me, knelt down beside the couch, and said, "You should try to be more like me with the baby. Maybe then she'll sleep better." The words stung. They weren't helpful. They were belittling. I stood up, still holding our daughter, and said, "Susan, please. I need you to respect my boundaries. I'm doing the best I can here, and I don't need your constant criticism." She just looked at me, a smug smile forming on her lips. "You're being too sensitive," she said. "It's all in the way you handle things. You'll learn." That was the moment I realized that I couldn't wait for Mark to wake up. I couldn't wait for him to realize how much pain I was in. I had to take control of my own life, my own happiness. I couldn't let Susan or anyone else dictate how I should feel or what I should do. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. I wasn't just unhappy in my marriage, I was being emotionally manipulated. Mark wasn't the supportive partner I had imagined him to be. He had become an extension of his mother, catering to her every whim and request while ignoring my needs and desires. I had spent so many years thinking that I just needed to try harder, that I had to be a better wife, a better mother, a better person. But the truth was, I was already doing everything I could. And I deserved to be supported, not belittled. The more I reflected, the more I realized how much I had compromised my own identity for this relationship. I had lost myself in trying to please Mark and his family. My self-worth had been wrapped up in their approval, in trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law. I had let Susan's passive-aggressive comments about my appearance, my parenting, and my choices chip away at my confidence, while Mark did nothing to stand up for me. And I had allowed it to happen. But not anymore. I began to set boundaries. Small at first, asking for alone time, telling Susan when she crossed the line, and demanding that Mark prioritize me and our family over his mother's control. At first, he resisted. He would dismiss my requests, say I was being too dramatic or overly sensitive. But with every step, I gained a little more confidence. I was reclaiming my life. One evening, I sat Mark down and told him everything I had been feeling. I explained that I couldn't continue in a relationship where I was constantly being undermined and disrespected. I told him how hurt I felt by the way he let his mother walk all over me, how he had failed to be the partner I needed when I was at my most vulnerable. He sat there, quiet for a long time, before finally saying, "I didn't know you felt this way." At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about his mother. This was about his inability to see me, to understand my needs. It was about how little he cared about our relationship, how little he cared about me. The moment we had to talk about our future, it became clear that he wasn't ready to change. He was still living in the shadow of his mother's control, and I couldn't be part of that anymore. The decision to end my marriage wasn't easy. We had been together for 5 years, and despite all the issues, there were moments of happiness, moments where I thought maybe things would improve. But deep down, I knew that the issues were never going to be resolved as long as Mark continued to enable his mother and ignore my feelings. One night, after yet another argument with Mark about the way he was handling things with Susan, I left the house. I drove around, trying to clear my head, to process everything that had happened over the past few months. When I came back, I knew I couldn't live in this toxic environment anymore. I knew I had to leave. I had to take control of my own life, my own happiness. I packed my things quietly, trying not to wake Mark. It felt surreal. This was the man I had married, the man I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. And yet, here I was, packing up my things and walking away from a relationship that had drained me emotionally and mentally. I didn't want to leave, but I knew I had to. For my own well-being, for my own sense of self-worth, I had no other choice. Leaving Mark wasn't just about walking out of a bad marriage, it was about finding myself again. It was about rediscovering my strength, my independence, and my self-worth. In the months following the breakup, I spent a lot of time reflecting. I worked on healing, setting new boundaries, and understanding what I needed from a partner. I surrounded myself with supportive friends who respected my choices and listened when I needed to vent. I also began to focus on myself, on my career, on my mental health, and on my happiness. I joined a support group for women who had gone through similar experiences, and hearing their stories gave me the courage to keep moving forward. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again. The person I was before Mark and Susan's control took hold of my life. Eventually, I met someone new. Someone who valued me for who I was, who respected my boundaries, and saw me as an equal partner. It was nothing like my previous relationship. With him, I felt free. I felt seen and heard. And I realized something important. I wasn't just capable of being loved. I deserved love. Real, honest love. Looking back on everything, I can say that ending my marriage was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. But it was also the best decision. I realized that I had allowed myself to be manipulated for too long, and the only way to break free from that was to leave. I am stronger now, more confident in who I am, and more sure of the boundaries I need to set in my life. I no longer seek validation from others, and I refuse to let anyone treat me as less than I am. I know my worth, and I will never let anyone diminish it again. Leaving Mark was not the end of my story, it was just the beginning. I have learned so much about myself, about my strength, and about the importance of standing up for what I deserve. And I know no matter what comes next, I will be okay.